Hey there nation, welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and we are back with an episode of Cheap Shots. This is episode number 39, and in this episode we're going to show you guys how to cheaply and quickly paint up some Wood Elves Glade Guards. And as you can see in this photo, this is what the end result will look like with your unit of 14 Glade Guard. At the same time, it only costs you $31.32 in order to paint up this unit, and that's assuming of course that you have to buy everything on the list in order to do this. And at the same time, save you a grand total savings of $163.93 by doing it the Cheapskate method instead of painting up the Army Painter as well as Games Workshop method. So with that being said, let's get this video on a roll and talk you guys how you can paint up some Glade Guard cheaply and quickly. And as an added bonus, we're also going to show you guys how to cheaply and quickly paint up the Sisters of Twilight as well. And as you can see, those are the two little riders on top of the Forest Dragon miniature right there as well. That's actually a homemade conversion. I actually had the Wood Elf Dragon just kind of like sitting around in my army already painted up a long time ago. However, I did not have the riders in order to make the Sisters of Twilight. And all I did is I just took two Glade Guard because, let's face it, the Sisters of Twilight look like Glade Guard. That's what they look like. I just paint them up just a little bit different to mark them as the Sisters of Twilight, and then I glued them onto the wood Forest Dragon. So that being said, let's go and talk about how we got this done. Alright, so first of all, for both the Sisters of Twilight as well as the rest of the Glade Guard, you will need to prime these up in Rust-Oleum flat white primer. I get that at my local Walmart, cost me $3.99. And then when you're done with that, the next thing you work on is the flesh. There's not very much flesh exposed on these miniatures, maybe on the hands and the faces, that's about it. And because these are Wood Elves and I want to make them have a paler flesh color, I decided just to base coat them in 2 layers of Peaches and Cream by Delta Serum Coat. That costs you about costs you about 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby. So all I do is just put 2 thin coats of that paint on the flesh. It's very, very pale flesh color, looks almost white. At the same time, it does a really good job with these elvish characters. So just put 2 thin coats on that, and you're ready to move on. Now for the next step for the Glade Guard, I decided to paint up the hair is what I decided to do. So in this case, I wanted a bright, vibrant color to make them look a little bit different. Traditionally, whenever I paint up my High Elves, I usually give my High Elves kind of like a blondish kind of hair color, just because that's what I imagine what High Elves look like. For my Dark Elves, I usually focus on the darker hair colors, because that's what I imagine what Dark Elves look like. So for Wood Elves, I didn't always imagine them having like reddish color hair, so because of that, I use Ripe Tomato by Apple Barrel Paint. It runs at 50 cents at your local Walmart. Just do 2 thin coats of that on the hair that is exposed for the Glade Guard. So that way it look like they have like a nice kind of auburn look with their hair. Now, as for the Sisters of Twilight, I painted their hair up a little bit differently because one sister is supposed to represent light while the other sister represents dark. I'm not sure which name goes with it. I think Nastra is the light one and Arhan is the dark one, I think. Either case, pick one of your Glade Guard to be the light one. In this case, I use Ivory by Apple Barrel Paint to paint up her hair. That cost you 50 cents. I use Pavement for the one that represents for the darkness, and that also costs 50 cents too. Both are made by Apple Barrel Paints, and both can be found at your local Walmart. So do 2 thin coats of that for both their hair, and then you're ready to move on to the next step. So the next step, of course, is a base coat. And as you can see, I decided to go with this kind of like Peter Pan type of paint scheme for Wood Elves. Wood Elves use a lot of earth colors as well as natural colors within their clothing because they blend in with the forest of Athelorn. So in this case, I decided to use Apple Barrel's Palm Green to do majority of the clothing that the Wood Elves wear. So things like their shirts, their long sleeves, as well as their pants, I just picked that on 2 thin layers of palm leaf. It's a nice, beautiful pale green color. Kind of reminds me a little bit of Goblin Green for those of you guys who remember Games Workshop's paints from way back in the day. It's a nice, vibrant green for that one. It does a really good job blending with the background as well. So just do 2 thin layers over all the parts I want to be palm green, and that's all you do. You can get that at your local Walmart for 50 cents. So now that we got the base coat down, the next step, of course, is to do a dry brush. The dry brush allows the palm green to stay in the recesses, and then, of course, the dry brushing brings out the highlights and all the texturing. In this case, I use Lime Sherbet by Apple Barrel Paint. It runs you 50 cents at your local Walmart. It's a good, chalky, pastel green that brings out a lot of the details within their clothing, because the elves have like all these little cording and wrappings and foliage interwoven with their clothing. So this is a good product to use in order to bring out those details. So as you can see there for the unit of Glade Guard there on the right, as well as for the Sisters of Twilight, all the parts that I painted in palm leaf, I just dry brushed it real lightly with some Lime Sherbet and did a really good job. Now remember, when it comes to dry brushing, it's always a good idea to apply just a little amount of dry brushing first and then build up to the degree of lightness that you want, because it's always easy to add more dry brushing to miniature. However, if you do too much at once, it's really difficult to take off. So that's my suggestion to you. So Apple Sherbet for the dry brushing. So the next step, of course, is to work on all the base coats for all the leather goods that are on these miniatures as well. And so because of that, I decided to go with some different shades of brown for the leather goods for these miniatures. And the reason why is because if you were to paint them all the same in color of brown, they would just all look identical. So I wanted to create some color variety within the miniatures themselves for the leather goods. So I decided to go with 4 different paints. As you can see on the left-hand side, I painted 4 of them up in burnt umber, which is from my Apple Barrel paint, runs 50 cents at your local Walmart. The next column I paint up in burnt umber, which is folk art, runs 75 cents at your local Hobby Lobby. The next group after that, the third column, is Anita's acrylic moccasin brown, which is 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby. And then finally, the far right hand side, I use nutmeg brown by Apple Barrel paint. You can get that at your local Walmart for 50 cents. So that way I have a nice range of brownish colors going in for all the leather goods. So these are things like straps that go across the chest, the leather shoulder pad that they have on their shoulders for the light armor, the arm greaves around their limbs to protect them from their bows, as well as their boots, their jackets, their cloaks, not their cloaks, their tunics that they also wear over their green clothing. So whatever sections that you want to make brown, I just put 2 thin layers of these different varieties. And these are the colors that I use to create some differentiation between all of them. So now that we got the base coat for the leather goods down, next thing we need to do now is a dry brush. So the dry brush color I used for this was Territorial Beige. I use exactly the same color for all of the leather goods because it does a wonderful job bringing out all the details for all of them. So because I just did a really thin dry brush of that all over the parts that I painted in the various shades of brown as well. And this is what the end result looks like. So you can see it looks really, really cool as well. On my 14 Glade Guard there in the middle looked really awesome. Same thing with the 2 sisters on either side. Does a wonderful job bringing up those highlights, while at the same time leaving that darker brown into the recesses of the miniature as well. So now that we're done with the leather goods, the next thing we need to work now is on the clothing some more. So now we're working on the detail aspects of these miniatures. Things we're working on now are the tunics that they wear. Some of these guys have loincloths as well as tunics laying off their off of their clothing. So to make it look like leaves, I decided to paint those up in 2 thin layers of Holly Branch by Apple Barrel paint. It's a nice, crisp, darker green color. It runs at 50 cents at your local Walmart. Put 2 thin layers on all the parts that want to be dark green. So things like the shirts, the loincloths, the wraps that are hanging off their arms. Also, a lot of these miniatures for the Wood Elves have like these half mask type of armor pieces that are on their heads. So because I picked that out in holly green as well, just do 2 thin layers of that all over those portions are dark green. Also add some contrast. The different layers of green also kind of helps them blend in like camouflage and the forest as well. And at the same time, it kind of gives them this Robin Hood-esque kind of Peter Pan look, which is actually kind of neat as well. So now that we're done with the base coating, next step of course is a dry brush. So for the Holly Green, I decided to use Folk Arts Fresh Foliage. It runs you about 75 cents at your local Hobby Lobby. It's a nice, bright mint green that's also kind of has like a little bit of a pastel chalky finish to it as well. And as you can see, I just did a really light dry brushing of foliage green on the Holly Branch that's all over these miniatures as well. Now, I will recommend that you go very light with it because foliage green is a very opaque color. So if you put too much on, it's just going to overpower the darker colors beneath it. So once again, just a very, very, very light amount. You just want just enough to pick up the texturing and the highlights of the Holly Branch. That's all you really want to do on that part because it's a really powerful color. So the next step, of course, is to work on the cloaks. So I first start off with the Sisters of Twilight because they're going to be different. We're using different colors for them to signify the fact that they are the special characters of the Sisters of Nature and all our hand as well. So for the one sister that is dedicated to darkness, I used Wild Iris by Apple Barrel Paint. Runs at 50 cents at your local Walmart. It's a nice dark purple color, and because of that, kind of makes it look like she matches with the darkness. So I just did 2 thin layers of Wild Iris on the cloak that she's wearing, so that way you can, signal her out as a special character. And as for our other sister who is dedicated to light, I use Wisteria by Delta Cerancoat. This is a very, very, very old bottle of this stuff, but it's still made by the company. You can get this at your local Hobby Lobby for 65 cents. It does a beautiful pale purple color as well. It's kind of like a mixture between I guess like a fuchsia, like a darker fuchsia is what it is. So it's a nice, beautiful purple color to use to create that contrast, to make it look like a special character. At the same time, kind of show that she's also dedicated to light. So now we've done 2 thin layers of the base coat for the cloaks. The next thing we need to do, of course, is dry brush them. So in this case, I decided to dry brush them both with exactly the same color, which is Lilac Mist by Apple Barrel Paint. It's a nice pastel fuchsia purple color. And so I did just a really light dry brush for both miniatures as well. It does a really nice job on the finish on that part. So you can see there, you can see the highlights bringing on both cloaks with the Lilac Mist, while that darker color is still in the recesses. And if you notice on these miniatures, they all have kind of like this chalky appearance. And the reason why is because you're dry brushing miniatures. That happens. Now, if you're seeing that and you're freaking out, don't stress out. The reason why is because when we get to the wash phase, when we apply oil wash, it's going going to smooth out that texture. It's also going to blend the colors together as well and give you a really nice tabletop standard as well. So if you're worried about this chalky pastel look, don't worry, it's all part of the process. Now, for the rest of the Glade Guard, I decided to keep on with the theme of that earthy kind of woodland type of color scheme. So for them, I used English ivy green on all of the cloaks that they're wearing as well. Make it look like ghillie suits is kind of what I was kind of going with. And the cool part about it is it kind of also matches the same color that the characters wear in the Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring. In the Fellowship of the Ring, they wear these green olive drab cloaks, elvish cloaks that were given to them when they went to, I forgot which one, the name of the magical forest, but all the characters wear it, so it looks really, really cool. Well, this is the same kind of look I kind of established on these guys, so I thought it looked really, really awesome as well. That they look like they're wearing the same kind of cloak that the characters from Lord of the Ring is. So just put 2 thin layers of English ivy green. You can get this at your local Walmart, costs you 50 cents. It does a beautiful job creating this kind of olive drab effect on all of their clothing, so it looks really, really good. So now that we've done the dry brushing on the cloaks, the next thing we need to do, of course, now is another dry brush. And once again, we're going back with a dry brush with fresh foliage by Folk Art. Runs you 75 cents to your local Hobby Lobby. And once again, just doing a very, very, very light dry brush with this color. Like I said, the fresh foliage is a very opaque color, which means that whenever you put it on top of a darker color, it just overpowers a darker color right beneath it. So you just need to put a very thin layer of this stuff, dry brushing, just enough to bring out the texturing. So for example, like the older miniatures there, they have like this fur lining inside of their cloaks. It does a really good job bringing that out as well. Same thing with the flatter areas and surfaces of the other cloaks. It brings up a lot of the highlights as well as the folds in the fabric, while at the same time leaving that darker olive color from the English ivy green still in the recesses as well. So once again, like I said, always when it comes to dry brushing, always start off with a very light coat first and then add layers upon it to the degree of brightness that you want. I want to keep these cloaks still kind of dark because I want to make it look like it's camouflaging them. So I just put 1 thin layer on, but put as many layers as you like. Alright, so now that we're all done with that, the next thing we need to do now is on the finer details for the miniatures. The first thing we use, of course, is khaki paint. This is for all the weapons that they're carrying. So Wood Elves have these really awesome looking bows. They also have spear shafts on them as well. So all those bows and spear shafts, as well as the cording of the wrappings around the midsections of their armor, I picked all that out in the same color, which is khaki by Apple Barrel Paint. That runs you 50 cents at your local Walmart. And the reason why I went with khaki for all the wood stuff that they carry is because I want to make this idea that the wood that they use in their weapons is a little bit different than what the rest of the world uses. Everybody else uses like normal timber, whereas the Wood Elves use magical foresty type timber from the forests of Athelorn, I would have you believe. So because of that, I figured that pale wood khaki color would look do a really good job in order to get that effect across. So that's what I did, is put 2 thin layers of khaki paint on all the wood that they're carrying as well to make that pale wood color, because that is magical wood, I would have you believe. So there you do. Just put 2 thin layers on that and you're ready to move on. So the next color after that I use is Bright Magenta by Apple Barrel Paint. Another paint that you get at your local Walmart, runs you 50 cents. Beautiful product. All I used that for was for all the quivers, the arrows that the characters are carrying. So each of the characters has a quiver on their back with arrows sticking on it. And of course the arrow shafts, I painted those in khaki to make them look pale. And for the feathers, I paint those in Bright Magenta. And the reason why I did that is a couple of reasons. One, it's a really nice bright color that contrasts very nicely with all the darker colors that you see already on the miniatures. Add a little bit of brightness on there. Secondly, Bright Magenta is also very eye-catching as well, so that way it looks like, oh yeah, these guys are carrying arrows on their back, they don't blend in too well. And lastly, because I wanted the arrows to look magical, quote unquote, and the reason why is because these are Wood Elves, they fire magical arrows of different types, and so I figured with the magenta fletching with the pale wood, make it look really odd and, mystical. So I decided to go with that look, and that's the reasons why I went with that color. So just put 2 thin coats of Bright Magenta on the fletching of the arrows, and then ready to move on to a dry brush. So for the fletching of the arrows, I used Cameo Pink to do a dry brush real quick on all the fletching that I painted earlier in Bright Magenta. It's a nice contrasting color, it's very pastel. It also does a really good job of bringing out the texturing as well as the highlights on the arrows, and while leaving the Bright Magenta in the deeper recesses. So do a quick dry brush real quick with Cameo Pink, and then you're all done with the arrows. Alright, so now we're starting to get down to the wire on some of the finer details. The next step, of course, I use is to bring out all the stitching in their clothing, as well as the grips around their bows, as well as some gemstones and some other smaller details. With those, I picked those out in Tahitian Blue by Delta Serum Coat, runs at 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby. And the reason why I use this color is because the Tahitian Blue is a very bright color. It's a very eye-catching color. I like using it quite a bit in my own miniatures. And at the same time, it also contrasts nicely with the green and the khaki that we use to paint these miniatures as well. So things like the individual stitches of fabric along their arm greaves, as well as in their tunics. I also use this color for the wrapping of the grips of the bows, because that Tahitian Blue does a really nice job to contrast with the khaki, adding more to that quote-unquote mystical look, which looks really cool as well. I also use it along the cording of the hornblower there on the center of the table, as well as the gemstone on the battle center of the saddle bearer right there in the middle of the unit as well. And so I just put out 2 thin coats of Tahitian Blue for all the parts that wanted to be that bright color. It's a nice contrasting color, and also adds a little bit of variety to your miniatures. So now that we're done with most of the details, the last thing to do now is work on the metallics. Alright, so the next step, of course, is to base coat all the parts of these miniatures that are going to be in metal colors. And there's not very much metal on these guys, and the reason why is because wood elves are mystical elves that live in the forest. They live in harmony with their surroundings, so they don't have much metal. So the metal details on this is actually very sparse. What I used was 3 different colors. First of all, I used gunmetal gray for all the blades of the weapons. So things like the blade of the spear, the hornblowers on his spear, I used for the blade of the standard bearer, as well as a sword and spear for the champion for the unit as well. Just put 2 thin layers of gunmetal gray on that. It's a nice dark metallic color, perfect for sword blades and weaponry. The next thing I used, of course, was Anniversary Silver by Folk Art, runs to 75 cents to your local Hobby Lobby, and I use this for all the archers. So if you look on the back of the archers, they have these quivers with these really cool wavy leaf designs sculpted into their quivers. So I painted those out in Anniversary Silver because it's a nice bright silver that contrasts nicely with the brown leather. At the same time, I also used it on the tips of their bows as well. So on the top notch and bottom notches of their bows, I picked those out in Anniversary Silver to make it look like, you know, mystical metal that's intertwined with their bows, I would have you believe. And the very last thing, of course, that I did is, of course, pick out any finer details with gold. So for example, on the spearmen, the guys carrying spears, I wanted the connection that between their blades as well as the shaft, I wanted that to be in gold, just to add a little bit of variety to that as well. There's also a couple of charms on those old pewter models as well. At the same time, a couple of them also wear like these kind of like bands around their midsections which are encrusted with gemstones. So I picked those out in gold as well. So very few details on this are actually metallic colors. Primarily this is the command group is where mainly most of those colors are located at. And once again, just do 2 thin layers of each of these colors. And the very last color that I used, of course, was Winter Green by Apple Barrel Paint. Just did it 2 thin layers, and these are for the gemstones. So there's very few of these. In fact, just the command group is the only guys who have this, because these are older pewter models, which have gemstones along that band around their midsections like I talked about earlier. I just picked out Winter Green. Just 2 thin layers, a nice minty green that contrasts nicely with the green tones that they are already wearing. At the same time, make it look like precious gemstones. So just put 2 thin layers of Winter Green, and with that, we are done with all the base coating as well as the dry brushing. So the next step is an oil wash. Alright, this is where we get to the oil wash, which is basically where we get to the quick paint method of this portion of the work. So most people, when they do the oil wash for the quick paint method, they usually use Army Painter Strong Tone, which is a wonderful product, does a really good job. The problem is that it's super expensive. That stuff runs you $32 a can, while a can of Midwax Poly Shades Mission Oak runs you only about $7, so it's a fraction of the cost. So all you gotta do, of course, take the Mission Oak Poly Shade and just kind of wash it like an oil wash all over the entirety of the miniature. Just take a paintbrush, an old paintbrush, because it's got to chew up your paintbrushes. Use that stuff, paint all over the miniatures, let it seep into the recesses, and just let it dry and cure. It is a stain, so because of that, it does a beautiful job of basically acting like a wash, blending all the colors together, smoothing out the texturing between the dry brushing and the base coating. And at the same time, blending the colors in together, it also goes into the recesses, bringing out all those details with darker color. As you see, these guys look really awesome as well. And it also contains polyurethane inside the mix as well, which means when this stuff dries, you'll have like this shiny hard coat that'll be on the outside of your miniature as well, which kind of protects it as well and seals it up. So it does a really good job for doing both of those. My suggestion to you is to wait 24 hours once you apply this poly sheet all over the miniature. The can says that the product will be ready in about 2 hours, but if it's still sticky after 2 hours, it's not dried and cured all the way yet. So it's just better to wait the very next day to work on these guys. So that way they have time to cure, and that way they don't have to worry about messing up your finish as well. So because of that, my suggestion is to paint all your base coating and your dry brushing one evening and then oil washing them, leaving it alone, and then moving on to the next time that you paint the next day, move on from there. Alright, the next step is a spray varnish. Now this step is optional. If you like that shiny candy coating finish on your miniatures, you could just skip this phase, but however, I don't like that. I like my miniatures to be a little bit more matted, so because I use matte finish by Krylon Paint, runs you $3.99 at your local Walmart. Just do it once over real quick with that can of matte varnish, and you see it does a beautiful job bringing on that sheen, and you can see all the detail work that oil wash has brought out on the miniatures, and all the colors and everything else. It just looks absolutely awesome. So once we're done with spraying them down with the matte finish, the last thing we need to do now is work on the bases. So for the base of the miniature, I use the same sand base that I use on all my miniatures, which I've talked about some length in previous videos. All you do is just take some wood glue, the cheapest wood glue you can find, paint the bases with that, then dust it with sand from outside of your house, like in a sandbox or outside somewhere, because paying for miniature sand or modeling sand is insane to me. So just dust it with some sand, let it dry, and then wash it over again with an equal mixture of water and wood glue to act as a sealant as well. Once that completely dries, just add 2 thin coats of English ivy green to the top of the miniature, so that way all the textured surface has that nice dark color. I'm kind of going with this forested foliage undergrowth type of look because these guys look like they live in forests. That's what the kind of illusion I'm going to give with this basing work that I'm doing. So the very last step, of course, is I use a Territorial Beige by Apple Barrel Paint. Runs at 50 cents at your local Walmart. What I first do is I dry brush all the parts I did in English Ivy Green. I dry brush that with a thin layer of Territorial Beige. It kind of creates like this leafy, grassy, kind of like dead undergrowth type of thing on the bases. It looks like they're walking through forest, and that's why I just kind of go with that. And then once that gets done drying, what I then do is I base the rims of the miniature in 2 thin layers of Territorial Beige, and then let that dry. And then once you're done with that, you are all done with your Glade Guard. So here we are with the end result of what your Glade Guard will look like if you follow the Cheapskate method. It goes a beautiful tabletop standard and it got done really quickly, at the same time saving you a ton of money at the same time. So this is what your unit of Glade Guard will look like when it's all completely finished. And as added bonus, this is what the Sisters of Twilight will look like when they're mounted up on their forest dragons. So as you can see, those are the 2 sisters I painted up earlier. They're just 2 spare Glade Guard that I had. Painted up a little bit different with some purple cloaks just to mark them as being different, and then I mount them around to the forest dragon miniature that I had. And the reason why is because when you look at pictures of Nature and Arhan, they look like Glade Guard. That's what they look like. Just straight up. So I was like, why do I need to spend extra money on finding some really complicated miniatures when I can just take 2 spare Glade Guard, paint them up to look like the sisters, and then glue them on top of this forest dragon. I put the one sister on the head of the dragon because that's what it looks like in the original sculpt. I put one on their shoulders because that's the positions that they occupy in the original photo of them. So now that we're done showing you guys how to cheaply and quickly paint up some Glade Guard and Sisters of Twilight using the Cheapskate method, let's go and talk about the savings that you would have. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through a list of materials and supplies that you'll need to buy from Games Workshop and Army Painter to paint up their method, and then show you exactly the difference in cost of using the Cheapskate method as opposed to that. So that being said, let's get that portion on a roll. Alright, so this is the Citadel and Army Painter method that they would recommend that you use in order to their products in order to paint up these miniatures the same way that I did. So first of all, you need to buy a can of Corax white spray for all the priming. That runs you $17 in order to do that. And then of course the flesh will be painted up in Flayed One Flesh, which runs you $4.55. The hair will be painted up in Troll Slayer Orange, which runs you $4.55 for that. And then for Nation Arhan, you need to use Longbeard Gray, $4.55 for that for the lighter sister. And then Eshin Gray for the sister that's dedicated to darkness, also runs you $4.55 for that. Now for all the miniatures, you'll need to paint up all their clothing in Militarum Green, which will be $4.55, and then dry brush it with Hellion Green, which will cost you another $4.55 on that. Now for the leather goods, you'll need to buy Wildwood, which runs $7.80, Bugman's Glow, XV88, as well as Doom Bull Brown, which all runs you $4.55, except for the Wildwood, and just do 2 thin layers on that for all the leather goods that they're carrying. You'll then need to dry brush all those in Baylor Brown, which runs you $4.55 for that. Now going back to their clothing, for all the tunics as well as the loincloths and stuff that we picked out in darker green, you need to buy Caliban Green for that, which runs you $4.55, and then you'll need to dry brush that in Cyberite Green for $4.55 for that as well. Now for Nation Arhan, for their cloaks, you'll need to buy Nagaroth Knight and Demonite Hide for the base coat for both their cloaks, runs you $4.55, and then dry brush both of those in Dakala Lilac, runs you $4.55. Now for all the parts that we're going to do for the cloak back to the Glade Guard and that darker green, ivy green look for their cloaks, you'll need to buy Vulcan Green, runs you $4.55, and then dry brush that again in Cyberite Green again. Now for all the parts that we did in khaki, which are the weapon grips as well as the bows, you need to buy Morgas Brown, which runs you $4.55, and then of course for the quivers. For the fletching, you need to buy Screamer Pink, which runs you $4.55 for the feathers, and then dry brush those in Emperor's Children, runs you $4.55 for that. For all the small little details that we're picking out across the miniatures, like in the stitching, as in the grips of their weapons, and then you bring those out in Baharoth Blue, which runs you $4.55. Now for the metallics, so the blades of the swords and spears, you'll need to use Lead Belcher, runs you $7.80 for that. For all the parts that are going to be in the lighter silver, like the notches of the bows, that's going to be needed by Ironbreaker for that, which is $7.80. And then for all the gold elements, you need to pick that out in Retributor Armor, or just $7.80 for that as well. The last thing you do, of course, is buy a tub of Gauss Blaster Green for all the gemstones, which is $4.55. And since you're doing this in a quick paint method, you'll need to buy a can of Iron Painter Strong Tone, which is $32 to do the oil wash. You let that dry for 24 hours. And if you decide to put a matte varnish on it, you can use Minotaur Varnish, which is $19.50 in order to do the, the matte finish on those guys. And as for the bases, you would just use Vulcan Green for the top of the miniatures, as well as dry brushing it, as well as rimming the bases in in Baylor Brown, and that's what you'd use, which you already have in the shopping list. Now, assuming you had to buy everything on the shopping list for the very first time by Citadel as well as Army Painter, we're talking about a grand total of $195.25 investment in order to paint up your miniatures in the colors that they would recommend from their products. Now, if you take the exact same list that I have in my Cheapskate method, however, that runs you $31.32 or pay for everything else to pay that with the Cheapskate method. So you take that $195.25 from the Citadel and Army Painter method, and you subtract $31.32 from the Cheapskate method, and we're talking about a total savings and difference of $163.93 being saved. So you see there that the price is just basically a fraction of what the Citadel and Army Painter were required to do by doing it the Cheapskate way. And that's money you could use for buying other miniatures, or not even spending it all and just saving it. Your choice. So that's going to do it for this one, you guys. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is invaluable to us as always. Also, check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for all the latest, greatest hobby news related to this channel. That's going to do it for this one, you guys. We'll catch you guys in the next one. You guys stay safe and healthy out there. Peace out.